It's 1945. The last echoes of war drift into silence. Cities awaken beneath quiet, broken skies. In a world covered with dust and dawn light, people begin to whisper the word peace. Let's drift gently into the year when the world began again. Welcome, dear listener, to 1945, a year that began in thunder and ended in stillness. Across continents, people had grown used to the rhythm of war, sirens, ration lines, and letters that arrived in trembling hands. Yet somewhere deep in every heart, a quiet thought had taken root: it can't go on forever. That thought carried soldiers across oceans, mothers through long nights, and children through the sound of distant planes. By 1945, the world was exhausted, weary beyond words, but it was also on the edge of transformation. The war had sculpted every breath of life for 6 relentless years. But even as battles raged through snow and sea, something gentler stirred, a yearning for normalcy, for laughter, for the sound of the wind without sirens. It was a year of ending and beginning at once, the last page of one book, the first line of another. The snow that fell in January landed on both battlefields and backyards. Somewhere in Poland, a door opened where it had been locked for years. Somewhere in the Pacific, a soldier folded a photograph, whispering that he'd be home soon. Somewhere in Japan, families listened to the hum of distant engines, not knowing that the world itself was changing above them. In 1945, people woke each day between despair and dawn, unsure if peace was a dream or an approaching truth. But as the months passed, the earth slowly shifted. Cities that had known only smoke began to breathe again. Gardens grew where rubble had been. Music returned to radios. Weddings filled with laughter, fragile and bright. This was a year of release. Of tears shed not only for loss, but for relief. A year when nations took their first, trembling steps back toward humanity. And as we drift through it together, we'll listen not only to the great events that changed the course of history, but to the small sounds that stitched it back together: the click of a typewriter, the scratch of a pen on a homecoming letter, the sigh of the wind through broken glass that still caught the morning sun. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. We are returning to 1945, the year the world finally exhaled. World events. The year 1945 opened under a cold winter sky, and under the heavy weight of a war that had lasted too long. Across Europe and the Pacific, soldiers, civilians, and the tired earth itself waited for the end. The maps were redrawn every week, the front lines shrinking like a shadow under the rising sun. In January, snow covered the ruins of Warsaw and Berlin. Cities that had once echoed with laughter now murmured with footsteps and wind. The Allied armies pushed east and west, closing the circle that had consumed Europe. In the west, American, British, and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine, the great river that had stood for centuries as both border and symbol. In the east, the Soviet army advanced through Poland, across frozen fields littered with abandoned helmets and quiet ghosts. And in those first weeks, hidden behind the headlines, something unimaginable began to come into view. As the Red Army moved through Poland, they reached a place surrounded by wire and silence, a place called Auschwitz. Inside were faces too thin to speak, eyes too hollow to understand what freedom meant. The gates were opened, but what was found would echo for generations. The liberation of the camps was both an ending and a beginning, the moment when the world began to see itself again, stripped bare of illusion. Elsewhere, in the skies above Europe, bombers still flew, their engines humming like an old and terrible song. But already, the notes were fading. By March, Allied forces had entered Germany. In April, the war's architects began to vanish, some taken, some lost in their own undoing. And on April 30th, in a bunker beneath a collapsing city, Adolf Hitler was gone. The next day, Berlin fell quiet. The guns stopped. In the following week, on May 7th, the German surrender was signed in Reims, and the next day, across the world, bells began to ring. It was Victory in Europe Day. Crowds gathered in London, Paris, New York, Moscow, people who had waited years to breathe freely again. Strangers danced in the streets, kissed under confetti, sang songs they barely remembered the words to. But behind every cheer was a tremor, the quiet knowledge of what had been lost. Peace came not as celebration alone, but as a soft, trembling relief. And yet, half the world away, another war still burned. In the Pacific, the islands were still aflame: Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Manila. The battles there were fought among coral, caves, and sea spray. Each one carried whispers of an approaching end, but also of unimaginable cost. By summer, American bombers flew deeper over Japan. The war seemed unending until August, when two small, blinding suns rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world changed in a single breath. For those who survived, the air itself felt strange, heavy with silence and loss. Buildings vanished into light. Shadows burned themselves into walls. The bombs ended the war, but they began a new era, one filled with both awe and fear, the knowledge that humanity had touched something vast and irreversible. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice reached his people by radio, most hearing it for the first time. His words were slow, distant, sorrowful. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. And just like that, after years of fire, the war was over. September brought signatures on papers, the formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The sea was calm that morning. Flags fluttered in the wind. Cameras clicked quietly, as if afraid to disturb the moment. The world exhaled, though few dared to call it peace just yet. In the months that followed, soldiers came home to find their cities half gone and their children grown. Streets once filled with marching boots were now lined with bicycles and laundry lines. Across Europe and Asia, rubble was cleared by hand. Railways were rebuilt, one wooden tie at a time. Nations that had been enemies began to share bread and bricks again. Meanwhile, new borders emerged like scars, Germany divided, Eastern Europe shifting beneath Soviet influence. In the West, a new alliance began to form, cautious, uncertain, but hopeful. In San Francisco, delegates from 50 nations gathered to sign the Charter of the United Nations. Their pen scratched softly across the paper, writing words of cooperation, trust, and the fragile promise, never again. Elsewhere in the world, empires trembled. In Asia, the long colonial dusk began to fade, independence movement stirring quietly in India, Vietnam, Indonesia. In the Middle East, in Africa, voices of freedom rose with the dust of war. In the United States, factories began the slow turn from weapons to washing machines, from tanks to tractors. The great industrial heartbeat softened, shifting toward peace. But perhaps the truest event of 1945 was not written in treaties or headlines, it was the collective exhale of billions. The silence after sirens. The rebuilding of dreams. The rediscovery of morning light. For the first time in a generation, the world could hear the sound of rain falling on rooftops without fear. The war was over. The world was scarred, but still turning. And in that turning, a new story began. One story that shaped 1945. 1945. The longest summer, the end of the war in Japan 1945. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific Ocean had become a sea of waiting. Across its endless blue, ships drifted like small islands of exhaustion. Soldiers slept on decks under the heavy sun. Letters arrived late, their paper soft with salt air. Each one carried the same unspoken wish: let this be the last. 1945. Japan was surrounded. Cities had burned through spring and early summer. Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, reduced not to ruins, but to memories of themselves. Streets once filled with merchants and laughter now held quiet, empty air. Yet life persisted in small, stubborn ways: mothers tending rooftop gardens of beans and onions, children walking barefoot through dust to collect water. 1945. And still, the war went on. Every night, the drone of planes rolled through the sky like distant thunder. Every morning, the newspapers promised endurance. But beneath the paper words, everyone felt it: the end was near, though no one could name its shape. 1945. Then came August. The air was heavy, and the cicadas sang endlessly in the trees, the sound of a summer that seemed to never end. 1945. On the morning of August 6th, in Hiroshima, people woke as they always did. Some cooked rice, some swept the street, some prepared to go to school. A few minutes past 8, the sky flashed white. 1945. What followed defied all understanding. Light, heat, silence, and then wind. Buildings folded like paper. Shadows were burned into the ground. The city became still. 1945. Far away, no one yet knew. Radios went silent. Telephones stopped. Only later would the world understand what had happened, that in an instant, a new kind of fire had entered human hands. 1945. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Another morning, another sky. Another silence. 1945. And then came words that Japan had never heard before, not from generals, but from an emperor. On August 15th, people gathered around radios in homes, temples, train stations. The voice that spoke was calm, trembling, distant, carried on waves of static. He spoke of bearing the unbearable, of ending the war, of beginning a new. 1945. Many wept. Others simply sat in silence. Children watched their parents cry without knowing why. The world had changed again, quietly, irrevocably. 1945. Across the oceans, news of Japan's surrender reached soldiers who had long forgotten what peace might sound like. On Pacific Islands, men looked at one another in disbelief. Some cheered softly. Others removed their helmets and stared at the horizon. In America, in Britain, in Australia, in China, radios crackled with the words "the war is over." In cities that had been blacked out for years, lights were turned on again. 1945. But peace did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhalation, long, slow, uncertain. For those who had lost, it came with questions. For those who survived, it came with weight. Hiroshima and Nagasaki stood not only as ruins, but as mirrors, reflecting the fragile balance between creation and destruction, hope and horror. 1945. In the weeks that followed, Japan was a nation of silence. People walked among ashes to find family, or simply to understand what had happened. Rivers became places of both mourning and cleansing. Amid the devastation, bamboo sprouted again through cracks in the earth. The mountains remained. The sea continued to move. 1945. Elsewhere, soldiers came home, stepping off trains with duffel bags and hollow eyes. Some returned to children they had never seen. Others to houses that no longer stood. In Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, survivors gathered what they could: a photograph, a spoon, a scrap of fabric. In Europe, refugees began their long walk back to homelands that no longer existed as they remembered them. 1945. The story of 1945 was not victory, nor defeat, it was the moment humanity stood still and looked at itself. For the first time in memory, every continent shared the same feeling: the war is over. 1945. It was said that on the night of August 15th, the stars seemed brighter. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps, after years of fire, the world finally saw the sky clearly again. 1945. In that moment, something fragile was born, the idea that peace, too, must be built, protected, and tended, like a garden after the storm. 1945. And so ended the longest summer, with tears, and silence, and the first uncertain steps toward tomorrow. Daily life around the world. After so many years of thunder, 1945 sounded like breathing. The clatter of typewriters replaced the drone of bombers. The clink of teacups, the shuffle of ration cards, the first chords of post-war music, these became the new sounds of the world. Europe, the return home. In Europe, daily life began not with comfort, but with clearing. Cities were skeletons. Berlin, Warsaw, London, Rotterdam, each carried the marks of fire. Yet in every doorway, people appeared with brooms, buckets, and quiet determination. They swept the dust away from thresholds and planted flowers in cans. In England, rationing continued. Sugar, butter, and meat were still precious luxuries. Families learned the art of stretching meals: carrots in puddings, oats in stews, powdered eggs for breakfast. Children grew used to the taste of invention. But there was laughter again. After years of blackout curtains, windows opened to light. Radios filled with music, and neighbors spoke freely once more. In France, wine returned to tables, even if the bottles were few. Paris buzzed with a cautious joy. The cafes reopened, smaller, simpler, but alive. Newspapers, once censored, now fluttered freely on street corners. In small towns, weddings were common. People married quickly, not out of haste, but from the desire to begin again. Every ring, every bouquet was a rebellion against despair. In Germany, life was heavier, quieter. Families wandered through ruins, searching for relatives or simply for a sense of belonging. Children played in streets made of broken bricks, turning debris into toys. Mothers traded bread for milk, shoes for soap, hope for the next sunrise. The occupying soldiers, American, British, Soviet, handed out chocolate, cigarettes, and canned peaches, small treasures that felt almost unreal. For many Germans, 1945 was not just the end of war, but the beginning of understanding what the war had meant. Eastern Europe, between shadows and seeds. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, the war had passed like a storm that left no corner untouched. Villages were burned, families scattered. Yet somehow, life continued. In Krakow, children returned to classrooms where the glass was still missing from the windows. In Budapest, trams ran again, clanging their bells through streets lined with rubble. Farmers returned to fields, pushing plows by hand where machines had been destroyed. Churches reopened their doors, and bells that had been silenced rang again, cracked, uneven, but beautiful. People cooked with what they could find: cabbage soup, rye bread, potatoes baked in ashes. The sound of the radio, once filled with orders, now carried songs again. And everywhere, new borders began to whisper into being. Some found themselves living in new countries overnight, not because they moved, but because the world had shifted around them. The Soviet Union, strength and scarcity. In the Soviet Union, the war had cost more than any could measure. Entire cities had to be rebuilt. Families had lost entire generations. Yet the spirit of endurance remained fierce. In Moscow, banners declared victory, but homes were still cold and bare. Trains brought soldiers home from the front, men missing limbs, women waiting on platforms with flowers wrapped in newspaper. Work began almost immediately. Factories roared again, now making plows instead of tanks, trains instead of guns. Evenings were spent in communal kitchens, where neighbors shared stories, laughter, and thin soup that somehow filled everyone. The United States, the home front transformed. Across the ocean, in America, 1945 felt like waking from a long dream. The factories that had built planes and ships now began to make refrigerators and automobiles again. Women who had worked as welders, engineers, and code breakers faced a new question: return home, or continue forward? Many did both, balancing motherhood and ambition in a world that had changed them forever. Cities celebrated the end of war with parades that lasted for days. Confetti filled the air like snow. But beneath the joy, there was a hush, for every soldier who would not come home, for every chair left empty at the dinner table. Life at home shifted quickly. Rationing faded, and shelves filled again with coffee, sugar, and silk stockings. A car cost about $1,000, gasoline was 15 cents a gallon, and a loaf of bread, 9 cents. In kitchens, the first frozen foods appeared, small miracles of convenience. Telephones became more common, radios more beloved. Families gathered around them each night to hear the world, now speaking not of war, but of baseball, jazz, and peace. And in suburbs still being built, the seeds of a new era were planted: lawns, fences, schoolyards, and the quiet hum of normal life returning. Asia, between ash and renewal. In Japan, life was fragile. Cities were shadows of themselves, wooden homes flattened, rivers choked with debris, food scarce. Yet there was resilience in every corner. Women collected scraps of cloth to sew together into clothes. Children went to makeshift schools, sitting on tatami mats with pencils made from charcoal. Bamboo sprouted between the ruins, a quiet promise that nature, at least, would not surrender. In China, the war against Japan had finally ended. Families began to reunite after nearly a decade of conflict. But another struggle, a civil one, lingered in the air. For now, though, there was rice cooking, markets reopening, and the sound of opera once again drifting through the streets. In the Philippines, survivors of occupation rebuilt from both joy and heartbreak. Flags were raised again. Songs of freedom filled the air, sung softly by people who had lived too long in whispers. The rest of the world, quiet continuity. In Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, the echoes of war had reached far but unevenly. Many regions had been drawn into the global struggle as colonies, providing troops and resources. Now, in 1945, a new mood stirred, a quiet awareness that the world's balance was changing. In India, independence felt close. Gandhi's voice, calm but firm, carried across the land. In Indonesia and Vietnam, new leaders spoke of self-determination. The end of one war had planted the seeds of many awakenings. The rhythm of ordinary life. Across every continent, certain rituals bound humanity together again. Morning tea. The smell of soap and laundry. Children's laughter echoing against walls still cracked from bombs. In markets, people traded stories as much as food. In homes, they mended not just clothes, but trust. Fashion reflected practicality, uniforms turned into suits, parachute silk into dresses. People found beauty in resourcefulness. Curtains became coats, old boots were patched and passed down. Entertainment slowly returned. Cinema was magic again, films offered color and song where the world had been gray. In America, Anchors Away played to cheering audiences. In Britain, brief encounter captured hearts with quiet tenderness. Across Europe, dance halls reopened, the sound of swing and waltz echoing through rooms once silent. Music became medicine. Laughter became rebellion. Even love changed. Couples wrote to one another not of longing, but of ordinary joys, shared breakfasts, gardens to plant, rooms to paint. After years of distance, the smallest gestures felt extraordinary. And through it all, the radio remained the world's heartbeat. It hummed through kitchens and camps alike, the same songs, the same voices crossing oceans of static. By the end of 1945, the world had begun to hum again, not loudly, but softly, like a lullaby to itself. People no longer looked to the sky in fear, but in wonder. And though grief still lingered in every corner, life, slow and stubborn, had returned. Science, inventions, and technology. The dawn of a new age. In 1945, the world stepped softly into a new kind of future. For 6 long years, science had been shaped by war, pressed into service, hidden behind secrecy, transformed by urgency. But as peace returned, those same minds and machines began to turn toward healing, rebuilding, and wonder. The laboratories that once designed weapons now whispered of possibilities. The hum of generators and the quiet scratch of pencils on blueprints carried a new rhythm, not destruction, but curiosity. Humanity had seen what it could do in shadow, and now it looked, cautiously, toward the light. The atomic awakening. Few inventions have ever changed the world as abruptly as the one born in 1945. In the deserts of New Mexico, beneath a pale morning sky, scientists gathered for a test they called Trinity. When the explosion came, the mountains glowed, and for a moment, the sand turned to glass. It was the first atomic fire, the silent beginning of a new age. That summer, its power would be unleashed over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war but leaving the world forever altered. In laboratories and offices from Washington to London to Moscow, people spoke in hushed tones about what this meant. The atom had been split, and with it, the boundary between invention and consequence. Yet even among the unease, some saw possibility. They imagined energy that could light entire cities, machines that could power ships and homes. The future seemed vast, strange, and shimmering, both dangerous and full of promise. In the years that followed, physicists would begin to dream not of bombs, but of peace powered by the atom's quiet glow. Medicine and healing. While one branch of science wrestled with its conscience, another was quietly saving lives. In 1945, penicillin, once rare and experimental, became widely available. It flowed through hospitals, field tents, and homes like a quiet miracle. For the first time, infections that had taken countless lives could be cured with a simple vial of medicine. Doctors spoke of it with reverence. Nurses called it liquid hope. Alongside penicillin came new surgical techniques, blood transfusions, and advances in physical therapy, all born from wartime necessity, now serving peace. Artificial limbs became lighter, made of aluminum instead of wood. For veterans returning home, they represented not just recovery, but adaptation, the courage to live again. Public health, too, took on new meaning. Governments began campaigns for sanitation, nutrition, and vaccination. In classrooms, children learned about hygiene and vitamins, small lessons in the value of life. The age of flight. Above the weary earth, another revolution stirred, one that sang through the air. Jet propulsion, once an experiment hidden in secret airfields, became reality. The first operational jet aircraft had flown during the war, but in 1945, its significance began to take shape. The jet engine promised speed beyond imagination. No longer would flight be slow and fragile, now it was sleek, silver, and strong. Engineers in Britain, Germany, and America studied captured designs, dreaming of peacetime uses, mail planes, passenger flights, horizons drawn closer. And beyond the clouds, a few dreamers were already looking higher still. In both the United States and the Soviet Union, scientists examined captured rockets and spoke, for the first time in whispers, of reaching space. The age of rocketry had begun quietly, like a rumor at dawn. The electronic mind. Deep in the heart of universities and military labs, another kind of machine was being born, one that didn't fly or explode, but thought. In 1945, engineers began assembling vast computers, rooms filled with wires, tubes, and switches. They were enormous, noisy, glowing creatures that could perform calculations faster than any human. One such machine, the ENIAC, was under construction in Pennsylvania. It would soon perform artillery calculations in seconds, a task that once took days. Yet even then, some saw its gentler future. In an essay that same year, a scientist named Vannevar Bush wrote of a machine he called the Memex, a vision of a personal device that could store knowledge, link ideas, and help people think more clearly. It was, in spirit, the earliest dream of the modern computer, of memory made mechanical, of thought shared with circuits. Few could imagine how such ideas would shape the coming century. For now, they were simply experiments, blinking lights in dark rooms, tended by patient hands. Everyday ingenuity. Even beyond laboratories, invention thrived in homes and workshops. Years of scarcity had taught people to repair, reuse, and reinvent. That spirit lingered. In kitchens, homemakers adapted military technologies to domestic life. Canned foods, dehydrated soups, and early frozen meals appeared, simple, practical comforts after years of rationing. In Britain, gas and electricity returned to homes, and with them came the hum of small miracles, toasters, vacuum cleaners, radios. In America, advertisements promised a modern tomorrow, houses with gleaming appliances, automatic washing machines, electric mixers, and bright chrome cars. Transportation also evolved. Jeep vehicles, born for battle, now bounce down country roads as farm trucks and family cars. Air travel expanded slowly, turning former bombers into passenger planes. Trains, too, were symbols of progress, running on time again, their whistles echoing not war, but renewal. And across all nations, the radio remained king. It carried music, news, laughter, and now, for the first time in years, commercials that spoke not of sacrifice, but of simple joy. A soft voice might say, "Buy fresh bread again." Another, "Listen to tomorrow." Science and the soul. 1945 was not just a year of invention, it was a year of reckoning. For scientists, the line between discovery and destruction had been drawn and crossed. Many of those who had worked in secrecy now spoke openly of responsibility, of using knowledge to heal rather than harm. At universities and in journals, a quiet moral conversation began, one that would shape generations of thinkers. Out of that reflection came humility. Science was powerful, yes, but fragile, too. It could split the atom or cure infection, it could destroy a city or save a life. And in that paradox, humanity saw itself. The tools of war had created a map of the future, a world of engines, energy, and equations. But what mattered most was not the machines themselves, it was what people chose to do with them. As 1945 drew to a close, the laboratories dimmed their lights for the night. Somewhere, a physicist packed away his notes. A doctor washed his hands. A mechanic wiped grease from his palms and turned off the radio. And outside, beneath the stars that now seemed impossibly far and endlessly near, the world dreamed of peace built by hands and minds, finally at rest. Culture and the arts. The sound of peace. When the guns went quiet, the world filled with other sounds. Pianos uncovered from dust, violins restrung, voices singing songs not of victory, but of longing. In 1945, art was more than entertainment. It was healing. It was proof that the human spirit, even bruised and breathless, could still create beauty. Music, the return of the human voice. Throughout the war, music had been a companion in the dark, a comfort sent across continents. But in 1945, its notes changed. The tempo slowed, the lyrics softened. Glenn Miller's orchestra had lost its leader the year before, but his music still drifted through radios, his melodies now carrying a wistful calm. Bing Crosby's voice was everywhere, soothing, familiar, like a hand on the shoulder of a tired world. It's been a long, long time. A song released that year became an anthem for those welcoming loved ones home. In Britain, Vera Lynn's "We'll Meet Again" became real. People did meet again, on train platforms, in dim cafes, in doorways filled with tears and laughter. In Europe's ruins, street musicians returned, violins echoing between cracked walls. And in America, jazz grew stronger, more thoughtful. Big bands gave way to smaller, more intimate groups. In smoky rooms, listeners closed their eyes, hearing both joy and sorrow in every note. In Japan, songs were softer, lullabies of mourning and perseverance. Traditional instruments, once silenced by air raids, were played again in homes, their sound fragile but steady. Music became the universal language of recovery. It crossed borders without passports, carrying empathy where words failed. Cinema, dreaming in the dark. The world returned to the cinema in 1945 like a traveler finding shelter from a storm. After years of newsreels and war bulletins, people craved stories, laughter, romance, escape. Projectors flickered again across cities and towns, their light dancing on faces still marked by worry, now glowing with wonder. In America, The Lost Weekend won acclaim for its quiet honesty about struggle and hope. Anchors Away brought Gene Kelly's effortless joy to the screen, his dancing a reminder that movement itself was freedom. In Britain, Brief Encounter captured the ache of restrained love, a film so gentle that even its silences felt tender. France saw the rebirth of its film industry with poetic works that explored memory and loss, while Italy, battered yet unbroken, began to give rise to something new, neo-realism. These films told stories not of heroes or grandeur, but of ordinary lives, mothers searching for sons, children playing in rubble, lovers meeting under bombed-out arches. They showed that even when the world seemed irreparably changed, the human heart still beat to the same rhythm, fragile, stubborn, endlessly curious. Literature, words for a wounded world. Books in 1945 were like bandages, soft, absorbing, and necessary. In Europe, publishers returned to press after years of censorship. Shelves filled again, paper still scarce but hope abundant. People read to remember who they were, and who they might become. In America, John Steinbeck released Cannery Row, a tender portrait of small lives and quiet dreams. Its tone was weary but kind, its humor gentle, a mirror for a world learning to laugh again. In Britain, George Orwell published Animal Farm, a fable that spoke of power, truth, and illusion with simplicity sharp as glass. Meanwhile, children returned to beloved classics, Peter Pan, The Secret Garden, The Wind in the Willows, stories that had outlived war, whispering that imagination, too, was a form of survival. In Japan, writers began to chronicle loss in voices hushed and lyrical, capturing both grief and endurance. Poetry blossomed everywhere, haikus about morning light, sonnets about return, free verse about the weight of silence. Words became both memorial and map. They named what had been lost and pointed, gently, toward what might be found again. Art, the colors of renewal. Painters returned to their studios, brushes stiff with neglect, canvases yellowed with time. For years, many had painted in secret, landscapes remembered, faces imagined, fragments of light kept safe from the dark. Now they painted freely again, often with fewer colors but deeper feeling. In Paris, Picasso worked in gray tones, his shapes still fractured, yet calmer now, his palette reflecting both relief and reflection. Henri Matisse, ill but luminous in spirit, began his paper cutouts, filling his studio with floating blues and greens. In Britain, artists sketched the ruins of London, not as tragedy, but as transformation. And in the Soviet Union, painters depicted victory as both solemn and proud, their canvases crowded with red flags and human faces. Art had changed. It no longer sought perfection. It sought truth, the beauty of survival. Even photographs, those frozen glimpses of reality, took on a new meaning. War photographers turned their lenses toward rebuilding, hands repairing roofs, children smiling at the camera with missing teeth, a flower growing through rubble. Theater and dance, the breath of life. Stages that had gone dark reopened. Curtains lifted to reveal simple sets, heartfelt performances, audiences hungry for connection. In New York, Broadway filled again with music and laughter. Carousel began rehearsals that year, soon to bring its bittersweet melodies to the world. In London, the West End recovered slowly. Actors performing to half-empty houses, but each round of applause carrying the warmth of gratitude. Ballet, too, survived. Dancers returned, their movements lighter, freer. In Moscow, the Bolshoi performed again. In New York, the ballet theater inspired with grace that felt like hope itself. Every performance, every gesture was a declaration, we are still here. Radio and the sound of storytelling. The radio was more than technology, it was a companion, a fireplace for the imagination. In 1945, it became the storyteller of peace. Dramas, comedies, concerts, and broadcasts filled the air. Families gathered each evening around the soft glow of the dial. In the United States, shows like the Jack Benny program and Fibber McGee and Molly brought laughter back to living rooms. In Britain, the BBC offered both classical concerts and gentle domestic comedies, restoring a sense of rhythm to nights once spent in blackout. News anchors now spoke of rebuilding, not battle. The airwaves, once filled with code words and bulletins, carried instead lullabies for nations learning to rest. Sports and small joys. In stadiums and open fields, people ran again, for pleasure, not escape. In England, football returned, muddy and glorious. In America, baseball games filled with crowds cheering not just for teams, but for normalcy itself. In Japan, children played games in schoolyards reborn from ashes. And across Europe, bicycles returned to the streets, their bells ringing like music. After years defined by struggle, 1945's culture was a soft sigh, not triumphant, not loud, but deeply human. Art did not erase pain, it transformed it. Music did not deny sorrow, it harmonized with it. Stories did not flee from truth, they embraced it, tenderly. And in all of it, the brushstroke, the note, the word. There was a quiet promise that beauty would always return, no matter how long it had been away. Media and headlines. The world speaks again. In 1945, the world learned how to talk to itself again. For years, words had been weapons, headlines designed to rally, to warn, to command. Now, they became something else, bridges of reassurance, carriers of normal life. The first months of the year still carried the language of war, bold letters announcing advances and retreats, bulletins that interrupted music, voices trembling between hope and fatigue. But by spring, the tone began to soften. Radio presenters spoke with gentler cadence. Newspapers began to print photographs not of explosions, but of reunions, soldiers kissing their children, women waving from windows, men rebuilding walls that had once been their homes. The front pages of change. On May 8, headlines the world over shared the same words, "Victory in Europe." In London, the Times printed it in calm type, no exclamation marks, just quiet gravity. In Paris, "Liberation!" shouted its joy in bold, sprawling letters. In New York, the New York Times carried photographs of crowds in Times Square, faces illuminated by disbelief and relief. Later that summer came another headline that the world read with awe and unease. Atomic bomb dropped on Japan. Few understood what the words meant. The article spoke of a single plane, a single bomb, an entire city destroyed. Readers paused, frowning, whispering the word atomic as though it were both promise and curse. Then, on August 15, radio stations across the globe carried the voice of peace. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Newspapers that day ran headlines large enough to fill entire pages. Japan quits. Peace. War ends. For a moment, the world shared a single heartbeat, the stillness of comprehension. In September, photographs appeared of the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. Men in uniform signing papers beneath a clear sky, the Japanese delegation bowing, the Allied officers standing in solemn line. It was an image of formality and forgiveness, the last frame of the war's long film. By year's end, the tone of the news had changed completely. Headlines turned domestic again. Food rationing to ease. Electricity restored to homes. School enrollment rises. Weddings increase as soldiers return. After years of tragedy, the small stories mattered most. The radio, the world's soft heartbeat. In 1945, the radio was everywhere, a constant hum in kitchens, barracks, and cafes. Its glow was warm and alive, like a candle that never went out. Families would sit in near silence, the only sounds the faint hiss of static and the clink of a teacup. The BBC in London opened its broadcasts with chimes that sounded like morning itself. In America, NBC's deep-voiced announcers spoke with measured calm, "This is the news." Everywhere, tone mattered more than words. After so much noise, the world craved gentleness. Even entertainment on the radio had changed. The jokes were lighter, the pauses longer. Comedies about families, kindness, and everyday life replaced propaganda and military updates. And in the evenings, orchestras played live, strings and brass filling living rooms where once there had been fear. The radio connected continents. In villages with no electricity, people gathered around battery-powered sets to hear the same symphonies as listeners in New York or Paris. When Tokyo broadcast Emperor Hirohito's surrender speech, many Japanese heard his voice for the first time, a sound both divine and human, trembling through the static like history whispering directly into their ears. The press and the price of normal life. For those who preferred paper to airwaves, newspapers were once again a comfort, their smell of ink and morning coffee a sign of peace returning. Censorship eased. Journalists wrote with freedom, but also with newfound care. They described not just the events of the world, but the feeling of them, the fatigue, the tenderness, the uncertain hope. Advertisements reappeared, quietly cheerful. "We're back in stock." Buy victory bonds for peace. Fresh coffee, welcome home. And in the corners of every front page were the details of ordinary living that had once felt impossible. Bread, 9 cents a loaf. A gallon of milk, 62 cents. Gasoline, 15 cents. A men's suit, about $30. The cost of returning to normal life was small in numbers, but vast in emotion. Magazines and imagination. Magazines, too, bloomed again like spring flowers. In America, Life magazine filled its pages with striking photographs, soldiers embracing their families, children playing in rubble, sunrises over peaceful skies. Time chronicled the shift from war to reconstruction, its tone proud yet reflective. In Europe, cultural journals returned, printed on thin paper but thick with thought. Writers debated ethics, recovery, and the new role of art and science. Even comic books flourished, bright, simple, full of heroes who used courage rather than weapons. Children devoured them, their eyes wide with color after so many years of gray. The mood between the lines. The news of 1945 was more than headlines, it was an emotional tide. Each story carried a duality, joy tempered by grief, hope edged with fatigue. Every reader knew that the paper in their hands was printed with both ink and memory. There were still reports of trials, of famine, of rebuilding. But nestled beside them were words of rebirth, new babies, new books, new beginnings. In that balance lay the soul of 1945's media, honesty without cruelty, optimism without denial. The world was learning again how to tell its story, quietly, humbly, truthfully. Evening news. As dusk fell each day, the world gathered once more around voices in the air. In London, in Moscow, in New York, in Tokyo, families leaned closer to radios, not in fear, but in habit, in comfort. They listened to the same message repeated in 100 tongues, that life was moving forward. Somewhere, an announcer signed off for the night. That's the news for today, August 15, 1945. Sleep well, wherever you are. And so they did. People born and people died this year. The turning of generations. In 1945, the world seemed to pause, but life, quietly and faithfully, went on. Even as nations rebuilt and mourned, children were born in hospitals, homes, and field tents. Somewhere, a baby cried for the first time while bells rang to announce peace. Somewhere else, an old soul closed their eyes, their life story folding into the silence of a new era. Every year holds such exchanges, birth and farewell, but in 1945, that rhythm carried a special weight. It was as if the world itself was being reborn. Those who arrived. Among those born that year were dreamers, artists, and thinkers who would one day shape the tone of the new world. In England, a boy named Eric Clapton took his first breath. His guitar would one day echo the sound of a post-war generation learning to feel again. In Jamaica, Bob Marley was born. His music would grow to speak of freedom, love, and unity across the earth. In America, Goldie Hawn, Steve Martin, and Tom Selleck, future faces of laughter and storytelling, entered a world just learning to smile again. Rod Stewart, born that same year in London, would fill arenas decades later with songs that carried both grit and grace. In Italy, Riccardo Muti, destined to conduct orchestras with timeless elegance, was born into a country rising from rubble. Others arrived who would guide the mind rather than the stage: philosopher Alain Finkielkraut, poet and Waldman, and engineer Steve Fossett, who would one day touch the clouds in flight. Each small life was a quiet promise that the world still believed in tomorrow. Those who departed. And as new voices entered the world, others gently left it. In February, the composer Bela Bartok passed away in exile. His final works unfinished, yet his music still breathing through pianos across the world. In the same year, painter and dreamer Wassily Kandinsky left behind a universe of color and form, his final canvases echoing the rhythm of abstraction that would inspire generations. The physicist Hans Fischer, who once unraveled the mysteries of blood, died that year too, his discoveries continuing in every heartbeat that followed. In the world of letters, the poet Paul Valéry passed away in July, his quiet reflections on art and thought now finding rest in the same silence he once wrote about. The world also said goodbye to Franklin D. Roosevelt, the American president who had guided his nation through both depression and war. His death in April was met not with applause or ceremony, but with an almost global sigh. He had been the voice that promised recovery, and his departure reminded many that even giants are human. Each of these farewells, each of these births, was a thread in the same tapestry. The names changed, but the song continued. One generation closed its eyes, another opened them, blinking into a fragile dawn. In the maternity wards of peace, in the cemeteries of memory, the same truth echoed softly. Life endures. The first winter of peace. By the final months of 1945, the air itself seemed different. The smoke had lifted, the sirens were gone, and the wind once again carried the scent of rain, of soil, of ordinary life. In some places, the snow fell over ruins, in others, it fell on new roofs, hastily built but strong enough to keep the cold at bay. It was the first winter of peace, and it felt both strange and sacred. Across Europe, people learned again the shape of silence. Not the fearful kind that came before bombs, but the gentle hush that followed them. Children, too young to remember a world without curfews, now walked home after dark under street lamps newly lit. In Paris, cafe windows glowed once more, fogging with warmth and laughter. In London, the bells of St. Paul's rang in December not for war, but for Christmas. In Poland, a violin played in a church that had no roof. The notes rose into the open air and disappeared into the night sky, a prayer without words. In Germany, families shared what they had, bread, potatoes, perhaps a little jam. They spoke of rebuilding, of forgiveness, of simply surviving the cold together. In Italy, candles flickered on window sills, their light reflected in puddles where bomb craters once were. In Russia, families gathered around stoves, the heat thin but the conversation full, stories of those who had returned, and quiet toasts to those who hadn't. And in small villages from Norway to Greece, church bells rang again, each tone a note of endurance. A world at pause. The newspapers that December were smaller, thinner, yet they felt heavier with meaning. Headlines spoke of peace treaties, reconstruction, the first post-war elections. Factories were running again, though now they built tractors instead of tanks, ovens instead of artillery. Government sent out pamphlets about rationing schedules, new housing plans, the need for patience. And yet, in between those official words, there was an unspoken message everyone seemed to understand. The hardest part, surviving, was done. Now came the long, quiet work of living again. For some, the year ended in reunion. Trains arrived at stations across continents carrying soldiers home. Mothers stood on platforms holding flowers and scarves, searching each window. When the right face appeared, the world seemed to stop. For a heartbeat, there was no past, no future, only that moment. Arms wrapped around uniforms, tears met smiles, and the noise of the train blended into laughter. For others, the year ended in absence. Not all came home. In their memory, families set an extra plate at the table, or lit a single candle and left it burning through the night. The flame flickered softly, a conversation between what had been lost and what had been found again. New nations, new dreams. Elsewhere, the world was still shifting. In San Francisco, the United Nations had been born, a fragile promise inked on paper, meant to hold the weight of human hope. 50 nations signed their names, their delegates dressed in dark suits and cautious optimism. They spoke of cooperation, of rights, of the duty to prevent what had just ended. The ink was barely dry, but already, people called it a beginning. In Asia, independence stirred like wind through tall grass. In India, Gandhi's voice was calm but resolute, freedom was near. In Indonesia, the red and white flag rose for the first time, fluttering over a crowd that sang through tears. And in China, whispers of another war, civil, internal, grew, though for now, people clung to the relief of peace, however brief. A Christmas of candlelight. December came with frost. In cities without electricity, candles glowed in windows. In Tokyo, families gathered around small meals, giving thanks for survival. In Moscow, choirs sang through snow. In New York, Rockefeller Center raised its Christmas tree again, brighter than ever, thousands of lights glittering against the night. People listened once more to carols and to the radio's gentle voice. This year, let there be peace on earth. Churches overflowed, not with ceremony, but with quiet gratitude. In places where faith had been shaken, it flickered back like a match against the wind. Everywhere, people found new rituals, planting trees, cleaning graves, writing letters to those still missing. Homecomings and orisons. By the end of the year, millions of displaced people were still on the move, refugees, prisoners, survivors, wanderers. Europe's roads were filled with footsteps, carts, bicycles, and sometimes silence. The Red Cross worked tirelessly, helping the lost find their families again. Slowly, names found names. Mothers found sons. Sisters found brothers. Some reunions happened in person, others only on paper. In America, returning soldiers brought stories with them of Normandy beaches, Pacific islands, and friendships that had outlived nations. They came home older, quieter, more thoughtful. Many married, found work, built houses, planted gardens. The post-war generation had begun, though no one yet knew what it would mean. In Britain, ration books were still part of daily life, but there was hope in every queue. The government promised new homes, new jobs, a new kind of fairness. A country worn thin by war now dreamed of something greater than victory, of equality, of care, of rebuilding together. In France, laughter returned to the streets. In Germany, children born during the war took their first steps in peace. And in Japan, where the scars were deepest, people began to plant flowers, morning glories and chrysanthemums, around the edges of ruins. From those blossoms rose a quiet message: even here, life returns. The sky above. As the year ended, the skies changed too. No longer crowded with bombers, they were vast and clean again. Pilots who had flown through fire now flew mail, food, and medicine. Airfields that had known only the roar of engines now heard birdsong. At night, the stars seemed sharper, perhaps because, for the first time in years, no smoke blurred them. People looked up and saw Orion, Cassiopeia, the Milky Way. Constellations had not changed, though the world beneath them had. For children born in 1945, those stars would become symbols of peace, silent witnesses to a year when humanity began again. The quiet of New Year's Eve. As December turned toward midnight, people everywhere prepared to greet the unknown. Some danced in crowded halls, holding one another too tightly to ever let go again. Others stayed home, exhausted but content, sitting by fires or under blankets. In London, Big Ben struck 12 for the first peaceful new year in half a decade. In Paris, champagne bottles popped softly. In Berlin, there were no fireworks, only candles in windows, flickering like small souls. In Tokyo, temple bells rang 108 times, each toll washing away one human sorrow. And in New York, as the Times Square ball descended through falling snow, voices rose together, Happy New Year. For once, the phrase felt literal. Across oceans and languages, it carried the same wish. May the new year be kinder. The world was still wounded, still wary. But beneath the rubble, beneath the fear, there was an unmistakable pulse, the sound of humanity returning to itself. That was 1945. A year that ended in light. A year that taught the world to breathe again. Goodnight, 1945. And now, dear listener, the year is ending. The candles burn low, the streets fall silent, and the long shadow of war finally lies behind us. We have walked together through the last echoes of battle and into the first whispers of peace, through ruined cities reborn, through songs and stories, through science and sorrow, through all the fragile beauty that still dared to grow. Somewhere tonight, an old radio still hums in a quiet kitchen. A family sits around it, listening to the same kind of soft voice that carried the world through its darkest nights. A child leans sleepily against their mother's shoulder, hearing the words peace on earth and not yet knowing how precious they are. And outside, the wind moves through the branches like a sigh, a lullaby sung by history itself. 1945 was not a year of celebration. It was a year of awakening. It taught the world how to grieve, how to rebuild, how to dream again. It was the first step on a long road toward forgiveness and understanding, a reminder that every ending, no matter how heavy, carries within it the seed of beginning. As the world stepped into 1946, hope was still fragile, like glass, but it was there. You could hear it in the laughter of children chasing snowflakes, in the scratch of a pen writing a letter home, in the hum of a factory now making toys instead of weapons. The world was learning to be gentle again. And as you close your eyes tonight, you might imagine yourself there. Standing in the quiet streets of that first peaceful winter, breath rising in the cold air, looking at a sky untouched by fire. The stars above you are the same ones they saw then. The same constellations that watched humanity stumble, fall, and rise again. The same light reaching across time to remind you. We survive, we rebuild, we love, and we begin again. Thank you for listening, for breathing with this story, for remembering the world as it once was. If this journey brought you calm, or helped you rest, I hope you'll stay with us. There are many more years waiting to be rediscovered, each with its own quiet wonders. Next time, we'll drift into the world in 1946. A year of rebuilding, invention, and rebirth, where nations learned to speak softly again, and dreams began to take shape in the dawn of peace. Until then, may your night be peaceful. May your thoughts be light. And may you carry with you the gentle truth of 1945. That even after the longest darkness, morning always comes. Good night, dear listener.